So it's just 11:30 now, so we're going to get started. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our second round of breakout sessions for the conference. This one is Virtual Space to Grow, Information Literacy, Social and Emotional Learning, and FYE. And our presenter is Jenna Stebbins, the Reference and Instruction Librarian at Naugatuck Valley Community College. So a couple of things before we get started. As you all heard when you joined the room, the session is being recorded. We're just asking that everyone please stay muted throughout the presentation, but we will have a Q&A portion at the end of Jenna's presentation. So if you want to put questions into the chat as we go along, Yoli and I will keep track of those and read them out at the end, or if you want to unmute at the end and ask your questions, you can do that as well. So with that, I'll introduce Jenna. She has played an active role in instruction design and assessment for the FYE Library program at Naugatuck Valley Community College since 2016. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you, Jenna.
Okay, thank you. So let me just get set up here with my slides and just make sure that the captioning is working. All right, is everyone able to see my slides and the captions?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. So welcome to the presentation, Virtual Space to Grow, Information Literacy, Social and Emotional Learning, and FYE. Today I'm going to be sharing with you the curriculum that we use for FYE Library, and that's first year experience library instruction at Naugatuck Valley Community College, and how we were able to do that in a virtual format over the past academic year. And the program learning objectives for today are to incorporate collaboration and active learning into virtual library instruction, and then also use the tools at our disposal as librarians to create an accessible and welcoming environment for students who are adjusting to virtual learning and maintaining the same atmosphere that we like to provide for our students on ground when they're learning, when they're visiting the library space with their FYE class for the first time. So first, a little bit of background about NVCC. We are a two-year college located in Waterbury, Connecticut with 3,162 FTE enrollment. The IDS 101, which is the first year experience course, is required for all full-time first-time students. And FYE has been partnering with the library for a while now, so that a required library session is built in, and the librarians actually handle all the scheduling of the FYE session. So we get the whole list of FYE courses, we schedule the sessions, we let the instructor know when their class visit is, and then that's all handled so ahead of time and handled on our end. And we also have a common curriculum that we use for all FYE classes. So some of the foundations for FYE library instruction at NVCC include defined learning outcomes at each course level. So we've written information literacy learning outcomes at the FYE 100 and 200 level, which help us with our instructional design each time we get an instruction request. And this also helps us to take a scaffolding approach and focus really only on what's important at that level and at that moment, knowing that in future sessions, students will be able to come back when they're at a 100 or 200 level and learn the skills that they need for those courses. So this has really allowed us to maximize the class time with what we want to get across during FYE. Another thing that's really helped us with maximizing class time is employing a flipped classroom model. And in this way, this actually began when we switched over to our discovery layer, Primo, which we call NV Search at NVCC. But we knew there was going to be, we would have to kind of change how we were talking about finding sources. So we introduced this pre-library exercise, which I'll talk about a little later, where the students get an assignment before they come for their library session, where they watch a video about how to use NV Search, our discovery layer. They see a live demo, they hear a librarian, then they're kind of walked through an exercise where they have to perform different searches and record their number of results and submit that. So they get hands-on practice with the discovery layer. They can kind of get introduced to things like typing in keywords and filters and just where to find everything on the website and what it looks like. And then once they get to class, we can really spend time on things like critically evaluating the sources that they find, because the mechanics are sort of handled ahead of time. So that's another thing that has let us focus on the types of things that we want to spend time on in class, which is active learning and collaboration and critical thinking. And then finally, we also have used virtual platforms for our FYE curriculum for a while now, prior to 2020. So we had the pre-library exercise, the in-class active learning exercise, and the wrap-up quiz, all taking place in virtual platforms already. The in-class exercise was a wiki that they worked in groups and submitted through Blackboard. And then the wrap-up quiz was also an assessment that they submitted through Blackboard. So in this way, we kind of already had that all set up. We did have to adjust to the actual teaching space being virtual and kind of figure out how to best utilize breakout rooms and things like that. But otherwise, all of that was really set up, and that was really helpful for us, and also the faculty that we had been working with for the past few years were used to getting that pre-library exercise, sending the links out to students ahead of time so that they can participate before class, making sure that students had access to things before class and all that. So that kind of worked out in our favor. Okay. The next thing I'll talk a little bit about is the best practices for teaching information literacy with the discovery layer. This is the research I did before we switched over to Primo, because we knew it was going to be a totally different way of teaching students how to find sources. So things like developing search terms, teaching limiters or facets, and emphasizing critical thinking is what we wanted to preserve in the FYE lesson. And then also, have a quote here about digital natives thrive in an environment steeped in multitasking, collaboration, and active engagement. And when I say digital natives, we're not assuming that because they're digital natives, they already know how to use everything. But we are trying to create an atmosphere that the students will be comfortable in. And in this case, things like multitasking, collaboration, and active engagement. So this was something that was really, really important to us that we wanted to keep as we transition to the virtual setting. And it was really the essence of our FYE program. So, we did the flipped classroom, we did all this research about best practices, and we came up with this group activity that took up the bulk of the class, and we really didn't want to lose that. So we started thinking about how we can help students adjust to the virtual learning environment, also while adjusting ourselves to the virtual teaching environment, get our information literacy outcomes across, and all while maintaining this atmosphere. And this is a theme that I'll probably keep coming back to throughout the presentation. So here's a preview of what our pre-library exercise looked like. It was administered through, we had done it in 2 different platforms. We had used Microsoft Forms, and then we also used LibWizard, which is a nice kind of side-by-side setup where students can see the instructions on one side of the screen, and then the NV search on the other side of the screen and go through the steps. So they had to view a video about how to use NV search. Then they had to perform a sample keyword search using limiters, and then they had to report on their results using a form. And so it was, how many results did you get when you did this? How many results when you used these limiters, and so on. So it kind of encouraged them to use all those different tools that are built into Primo. And this was something that was not graded. However, we did give participation For faculty members who wanted to count this as a homework grade, we did give them the list of their students who completed it so that it could be counted as a participation grade, but it wasn't something that they were scored or assessed on. It was simply something to do before coming to the library. Okay. And then finally, to set the scene here, we wanted to convey in the virtual setting that the library is a space, virtual or physical, where students are welcome to come and ask questions without fear of judgment and given tools to work towards a solution to their problems. We also wanted to balance the value of the live session, so meeting the librarian, being able to engage one-on-one with the librarian, talk to us, get comfortable with asynchronous access for those who couldn't attend live, either because they had a prior commitment or their technology wasn't working that day, or maybe someone who comes to the class but wants to be able to review the content afterwards at any time throughout the semester. So we wanted to balance those two things, and ultimately we had the opportunity to do both with the way that we set up our lesson. And this is something that we hope to preserve going forward as well, because prior to the 2020 academic year, we didn't really have as many options for students who may have missed their FYE session. They could schedule an appointment with a librarian to go over things, but now that we have started doing it virtually, we have a lot more of this content ready to go virtually, so students can really view this at any point in time. Okay, next, these are the information literacy learning outcomes for the FYE level. And the full matrix, which is the the FYE 100 and 200 level, is available on our website, and I have a link right there. So during the FYE session, what we want students to be able to come away with is identifying key topics and keywords that can be used to perform an effective search, explain why a particular resource was chosen to perform the search, and we really only differentiate between NV Search, the catalog, and the web, and we don't go into things like peer-reviewed journals at this point. We talk about articles generally and books generally. Selecting a source that is relevant to the given topic and is appropriate for use on a college research assignment, and then correctly identifying information that requires attribution and distinguishing that information from common knowledge. Additionally, we also want them to know that we are here for them. So I always say, in addition to all this, I'm going to be going over a lot of content today, but one thing that you can remember is that we're here for you and we're here if you need help. So our videos, our activity, our wrap-up assessment are all constructed around these learning outcomes. And they also set the foundation for what students will encounter in their 100 and 200 level courses. So they kind of move from choosing a source to actually using that source, pulling out the information that they need, and then thinking more critically about how that source was created and accessed. And that's something that we spend more time on at the 100 and 200 level. Okay, and then another really important piece in putting together our FYE curriculum was the ACRL framework. And I'm very thankful for especially the way that they wrote out the dispositions, because I think these put into words the same type of atmosphere that we really wanted students to be surrounded in as they learn to use the library for the first time. So even more importantly, during the 2020 academic year, when we were all going through so many changes, everything was different. It was a whole adjustment for not only being a first-time college student, but taking all of your classes online. And we wanted to really make sure that the atmosphere that we set up for using the library was one of trying, not being afraid to fail, knowing when to ask for help and how to ask for help when you need it, knowing that you can talk through problems with your peers, and that it might take more than one try, but eventually you'll get to what you need. And under the dispositions here, things like exhibiting mental flexibility and creativity, understanding that first attempts at searching do not always produce adequate results, and then persisting of search challenges. Those were huge. And we wanted to make a comfortable atmosphere where students were free to try things out without having the pressure of an assignment or, failing at their task, and just knowing that they could take as many tries as they need, work with their classmates, ask for help. And it was that kind of environment. Okay. And we also thought that these related directly to the more social and emotional learning skills that are important to the FYE curriculum. So, like I said before, the atmosphere was one of low stakes, trial and error, recognizing when to ask for help. And we also were very grateful to be able to still use the small group activity using breakout rooms in Blackboard Collaborate, because this, the way that we had done it in the classroom, we were able to go around and talk to each group one-on-one and ask students if they had any questions, which can oftentimes work better than just asking at the front of the class if anyone has any questions, and then the students have to raise their hand and ask their question in front of the whole class. And this could be more of a one-on-one casual conversation as they work through something. If they get stuck, we're right there at the point where they may have gotten stuck and they can just ask us for help. So that was one really good thing about being able to use breakout rooms during our FYE activity. And it was something that I was really glad to be able to carry over from the on-ground setting. Okay, and then finally, information about social and emotional learning here, which I think relates really well to those dispositions, and also something that went into our crafting of the virtual lesson, were things like understanding and managing emotions, setting goals, showing empathy for others, establishing positive relationships, and making responsible decisions. So anytime that students are asked to work in a group to complete a goal, they do have to rely on these types of competencies. And that was when we do this in class, it's really great to be able to see the groups engaging with each other and then actually produce something at the end that they're able to share with the rest of the class. So by maintaining the group format in our Blackboard Collaborate virtual space, students were still able to kind of get practice with these skills, maybe talking with a classmate who might have a different point of view on something or a different experience that they're bringing to the table. Maybe, oh, well, I've done this before for a class and I know how, so I can teach you how to do it, and things like that. So the other thing is, I also kind of changed my own frame of reference for FYE, because in the past, sometimes I've thought, well, maybe students aren't going to think that learning how to use the library is important right now because they don't have an assignment due, or they don't have the immediacy of needing to use the library to complete something for a class. But I flipped that and I thought, well, this is actually a good opportunity because it's low stakes. They don't have to worry about failing something if they're not able to find a source, or if they find a source that doesn't end up being the best source. They can try it and learn maybe why that's not the best source, so that when it does come time to have to provide a works cited list or a references list on an assignment, they feel a little bit more confident in that. So I think changing my thinking about what the FYE session is into more of an informal, we're learning this together, we don't have to worry about failing, talk it out, work things through, that really helped to set up this atmosphere as well. And for future sessions, I will say, I am still interested to know how much they do retain from this FYE session if they don't have another library visit in another class, and what they do use. So in the future, I've definitely thought about incorporating maybe a follow-up later in the semester for anyone who came to FYE to see, as they progressed and started getting research assignments, what they did end up using later on. So next, I have the lesson format, which we used in Blackboard Collaborate. So I started with an informal opening discussion so that students could practice using the chat feature. And I just simply asked, what have you used a library for? So it could be their public library, their high school library. I volunteered that I had used my public library a lot recently to check out ebooks. So I could still, do my pleasure reading while libraries were physically closed and I couldn't get books. So we had students say things like studying, working on group projects, printing, getting books and things like that. And that was just an informal check-in and also getting comfortable with the technology and the chat feature. Then we viewed a few videos for how and why to find different source types. So there was books and articles using NV search and finding credible internet sources. And these videos, these were something new for 2020. Before we had kind of just done this demo in class and talked about the characteristics of source types and how to evaluate them. But now that we've made them into videos, we realize this is really good for the students who weren't able to make it because they can view them on their own time. So that's something we'll definitely hold on to for the future. They then were assigned finding one source in their group, and the breakout groups were labeled by source type. So we had a book group, an article group, and a web group, and then we doubled up on maybe another group to find an article or find a website, depending on how many students were in the class. And the bulk of the lesson was really the discussion of the process with the other students in their breakout groups. So I have the discussion prompt questions on the next slide, but what we really wanted them to spend time doing was share their experience and what they found, talk about what advice they might give to another student who is about to complete the same assignment, and then talk about how they evaluated their sources. Once the discussion groups were ended, we reconvened as a class. We talked about what they found in an informal discussion. And as I had been kind of going around to each of the breakout rooms and checking in with the students to see how they were doing and answering any questions, I would then kind of bring up some of the points that I talked about with the individual rooms in the whole class, just to make sure everyone could hear that. And then the final part of the lesson was to submit their wrap-up quiz, which was 6 multiple choice questions that addressed the learning outcomes. All right, so our small group discussion prompts, these were what we asked the students to talk about with their group after they completed the finding of a source. And this gave students a chance to use the chat tool, the whiteboard tools in Blackboard Collaborate. They got to talk about their experience with searching. Question 2 allowed students to move from performing the action of searching to actually teaching someone else how to do it. What advice or search tips would you give to another student who's completing the same assignment? And group work had always been the highlight of our on-ground classes. We wanted to keep it. It fosters conversation, it encourages critical thinking and problem solving. And it also helps students who do need to ask for help feel a little bit more comfortable doing so as the librarian comes to them rather than having to ask in front of the whole class. And then also another thing we always like to get across is that as they evaluate their sources, they can draw on their own experience of maybe a time in the past when they had to fulfill an information need and how they may have determined that they could trust a source. So this is something that is not just an academic skill, but something that they likely have been using already, and just making that connection between their, real life, so to speak, and their academic life. So I touched on this a little bit before, but during the transition to the virtual setting, we did find a way to balance the live, not face-to-face, but camera to camera interaction between librarians and students, as well as asynchronous access for students so that they could get the experience of participating in an FYE library session at that designated date and time. So we created a LibGuide, which had all the materials on it that were used in the lesson. So if they had the link to this guide, they had the pre-library exercise that they started with, the how and why video demos for books, articles, and websites that they could view. It walks them through the steps of doing a search in NV Search, when you might want to use those particular source types, and how to determine if those source types are credible. And they have practical tips like looking at the publication date, Googling an author, checking out their website or their social media or what else they've written, and all different ways that they can employ later on when it comes time to find a source for an assignment. The LibGuide also included instructions for the activity of finding a source and the discussion prompts that they were asked to work out in their groups. And then at the end, it had a link to the wrap-up quiz. So all of this was available on a guide for the faculty to be able to share with their students afterwards. And we shared it with the students through the chat feature and also through screen sharing as we went through the lesson. And then just one more note about the use of Blackboard Collaborate. This is what most of the faculty at NVCC were using for their FYE. We did have a few instances where, for example, one instructor was using Teams, so we kind of had to adapt to a different platform for that. And then there were also varying levels of comfort with Blackboard Collaborate on the faculty side. So in some cases, we actually were added to their course shells. The distance learning office was able to help us out with that. We were added to their course shells, and then we set up the Collaborate session for students and sent out the link. And then in other instances, they were already using it, but maybe they weren't sure how to invite a guest to the class. So we had written up instructions that we sent to faculty to let them know how they can get the guest link generated and send it to the librarian ahead of class. And all in all, it went pretty seamlessly. The wrap-up quiz, this is what they submit at the end of the course, and we have been doing this for a few years now, and it's always been virtual, which makes it easy to score and see the data visualized. But there are 6 multiple choice matching questions that are tied to their learning outcomes. We used to do this through Blackboard. We moved it over to the Microsoft Forms feature, which is another opportunity for students to practice a different frequently used technology tool at NVCC. And it was scored for our data collection, but it wasn't a grade. So their score on that quiz had no impact on the student's grade in their FYE course, but it was simply for us to look at where they were getting the learning outcomes and where maybe we needed to adjust things with the lesson to work on some of those other learning outcomes. And the wrap-up quiz was also accessible after the session, which is nice because sometimes our discussions would go on for a long time, which you never want to end when you're having a great discussion about evaluating sources or, you know, what to do when you get stuck, or classmates helping each other out when they get stuck. And if that did happen, we luckily had an easy link to get back to the wrap-up quiz that the faculty could send to their students, and then they could take it at some point after the course, and we could still get the assessment data from the wrap-up. So the data that we gain from these kind of fillable forms that we give out to the students, the first one, this is participation only, but we can still get an idea of who's accessing the materials before the session. So how many students are engaging with their email or Blackboard post to do this pre-library exercise. and how we might be able to increase participation with that. And as I said at the beginning, we have been doing this for a while, so a lot of the faculty were used to it. They had been sending out this pre-library exercise for a while now, so it wasn't a huge adjustment. It wasn't new when we moved to the virtual FYE lesson. And then the wrap-up quiz. So this really helped us see which learning outcomes the students are mastering or which ones they're struggling with, and how we might be able to modify the lesson plan to address these areas. So students, they did score highest on questions about the elements needed to create a citation and when to use a credible website versus a library periodical database to fulfill an information need. They scored slightly lower on a question about differentiating between common knowledge and when it's important to cite a source. So that's something we may want to spend a little bit more time on in future sessions, because that's one of those important learning outcomes. And the average was about an 80% on the wrap-up quiz. So for future sessions, just some thoughts about what we might want to employ going forward. In the past, they did submit what we called a wiki. It was kind of like a research guide that they worked together on to show us how they did a keyword search and then find 2 to 3 credible sources from the library's collection or the internet. And then they submitted these and we were able to score them with a rubric. And this was a very valuable piece of the assessment puzzle, having that student artifact, especially because it was done in groups. So we could see, how did these groups work together to submit the final product. Now, we didn't want to overwhelm students who were already adjusting to the virtual setting with having to complete, a paper or an artifact, which would involve having maybe different screens open, which can be difficult, especially if students are accessing the Blackboard Collaborate course on their phones or something like that. So we didn't have them submit an artifact. We simply emphasized the discussion, maybe taking notes from the discussion, but that's really where most of the learning outcomes were addressed, was talking through these things with their group members and then sharing with the class. However, we would like to include an opportunity for online groups to submit an artifact of their work in the future. So if there's something that we could simplify for an online course, that we can just get those student artifacts to look at, because again, they are a really valuable piece of the assessment puzzle. And then another thing is measuring those social emotional learning competencies. So I thought it might be interesting to have some sort of reflection piece at the end where they talk about, what did you do when you got stuck? What did you do when you disagreed with a group member on something? And just have them write a short piece about what it was like to be faced with this task, work through a problem with groups, perhaps ask for help from a librarian or from a peer or from their professor. And it would be really nice, I think, to be able to gauge what kind of these social emotional learning, also the dispositions from the framework that students are employing as they work through what we've set up for them in the FYE lesson. So in conclusion, it was hopefully what students came away with were the ability to work with others, not giving up on the first try if they're not finding what they need, recognizing that takes practice, that searching is a process, not necessarily straightforward, perhaps seeking another student's point of view or way of doing something, and feeling comfortable asking for help. And knowing that the library is a place they can always come back to, and adding the library's website, the library's virtual assistance and supports for research help, as well as the library as a physical place, all of those things, adding them as another way of getting support, academic support, social emotional support, as they make their way through their college career at NBCC. So that concludes my presentation. So at this point, I will now answer questions that anyone has about our FYE setup.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation, Jenna. We did have a question from Melissa earlier, asking if the pre-exercise was done in LibWizard, but I think you mentioned that it was.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a question from Diane. She says, it looks like you are covering a lot in one class. How long is a class session?
Oh, okay, so the class session is 1 hour and 20 minutes.
And then I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you noticed any digital divide among your students, and if so, how was that addressed to ensure equitable access and inclusion to the class?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that we did address, we actually did a practice library instruction session before the semester even started with a group of students who were actually part of our Envision grant. And we did a library orientation for them, which was also the first time I had used Blackboard Collaborate. And some students had the laptops or the Chromebooks from the library. And in doing this, we realized that some features of Blackboard Collaborate were not compatible with Chromebooks. So we, during that one session, we didn't use those features. We only used things that everyone could access. And then after class, we said, okay, so anyone who has a Chromebook out right now will need to either get an updated one, or, we're going to stop lending out these versions of the Chromebooks that are not compatible with Blackboard Collaborate. And ultimately, we were able to solve that before the semester started, so that anyone who had a Chromebook at the beginning of the semester, thankfully they were the updated versions that were compatible with Blackboard Collaborate. So that was a good thing that we kind of caught that before the students came on campus, or before the students semester started. And then the other thing is, there was also an issue that only happened a couple times, but the students accessing Collaborate on a phone couldn't always participate in breakout groups. So when that happened, what we did was just kept the main room as one group. So they didn't get kicked out, and they weren't excluded. But we would just move several students back into the main room and keep that as one of the small discussion groups, and then the other students in breakout groups. So everybody was able to join a small group, even if the technology and the actual breakout groups weren't working.
That's fantastic. I think we all probably have learned the limitations of Chromebooks as a result of this pandemic. We have a question from Renee. She says, I like what you pointed out about not focusing the session around an assignment. Do you find that students are just as engaged and invested in this session as they would be if there was an assignment involved?
Yeah, so I think, the nature of the FYE curriculum is at Naugatuck Valley is that they actually are getting introduced to many different college departments and having guest speakers coming in from, the financial aid, the public safety, the Student Advising Center, which is called CAPS here. So they do meet a lot of different people from the college, and it's kind of like just getting to know all the resources. So sometimes I think they do see the library as, here's another resource that can help me out when I need it. I did have, after one session, a student said, this wasn't as boring as I thought it would be, or something like that. And that made me feel pretty good, because we weren't just, showing them the website and how to find things, but we really let them work together and accomplish a goal. And I do think it's hard to compare it because I didn't have as much experience with online teaching. So it is harder to tell when students are actually engaged when I'm not, actually going around to those breakout groups and talking to them. But in terms of participation, they certainly did participate to complete the kind of low stakes practice activity in class. And I didn't think that it was lacking just because they weren't required to submit an actual assignment at the end of it.
Fantastic. Do we have any additional questions from the audience? You can feel free to either put those in the chat or unmute yourself to ask verbally. So I think then we are just giving it one last chance.
Okay.
Awesome. So thank you again, Jenna, for this really fantastic presentation and really thinking about the intersections between information literacy and digital scholarship. I'm going to pass it back over to Jillian to let folks know what's happening next.